Mr. Abernathy's Festival of Lights. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped through the mail slot with all the other unwanted correspondence that Arthur Abernathy collected each morning at precisely 8 o'clock. He'd been in the middle of his tea, a perfectly brewed Earl Grey that he took in his workshop among the quiet ticking of the clocks he no longer repaired but still maintained. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive stock, with his name written in careful calligraphy. Arthur frowned at it. Inside, the request was simple and entirely unwelcome. The town council, it seemed, needed a judge for the annual Christmas light competition. The previous judge, old Mrs. Henderson, had moved to Florida to live with her daughter. They'd gone through their list of suitable candidates, and Arthur Abernathy, respected retired clockmaker and longtime resident, was their choice. Would he do them the honor? Arthur set the letter down beside his teacup and stared at it, as though it might spontaneously combust if he willed it hard enough. A Christmas light competition. The very thought made him wince. He'd seen the chaos that descended upon his orderly little town every December. Inflatable snowmen the size of automobiles, strings of lights hung with no apparent sense of spacing or symmetry, reindeer that danced to music loud enough to wake the dead. It was, in Arthur's carefully considered opinion, a spectacular display of excess and poor taste. He had every intention of declining. But then Margaret Thorne from the council called. She had that gentle, persistent way about her that Arthur found impossible to refuse directly. She reminded him that he'd known Mrs. Henderson for 40 years. She mentioned how much it would mean to the community. She said his eye for detail and precision would bring dignity to the competition. She did not say, though Arthur heard it anyway, that he had nothing better to do with his evening. That last part stung more than he cared to admit, so Arthur heard himself agreeing, his voice sounding distant and resigned even to his own ears. Margaret thanked him profusely, promised it would be simple and straightforward, and rang off before he could reconsider. Arthur sat in his workshop for a long time afterward, listening to the clocks tick their various rhythms, feeling something uncomfortably close to dread settle in his chest. He'd spent his entire life pursuing perfection. As a young apprentice clockmaker, he'd learned that precision was everything. A single gear out of alignment by a fraction of a millimeter could throw off an entire mechanism. There was no room for approximation, for good enough, for well-meaning effort that fell short of the mark. Either a thing was done correctly, or it was not worth doing at all. This philosophy had served him well in his profession. Arthur's clocks had been renowned throughout the region for their accuracy and craftsmanship. People had waited months for one of his pieces, knowing they were getting something of enduring quality. But somewhere along the way, that same exacting standard had crept into every corner of his life. He noticed when grocery store clerks gave inexact change. He spotted crooked picture frames in restaurants. He saw flaws that others seemed content to overlook, and he could not understand their tolerance for imperfection. It had made him, he had to acknowledge in his more honest moments, rather difficult to be around. His wife Margaret, God rest her soul, had understood him. She'd had a patience that bordered on saintly, a way of laughing at his fussiness that never felt cruel. But she'd been gone 8 years now, and Arthur had discovered that without her gentle presence to soften his edges, most people simply found him tiresome. Invitations had dwindled. Conversations at the market had become perfunctory. He'd become, though he hated the word, alone. Not that he'd admit to minding. He had his workshop, his clocks, his routines. He needed no one. The day of the judging arrived cold and crystalline. Arthur stood at his front window, watching the afternoon light fade to the deep blue of early winter evening. Snow had been falling since noon, light and steady, covering the town in what would have been, to anyone else, a picture-perfect holiday scene. Arthur simply noted that the snow was accumulating at approximately 1 inch per hour and would likely cause traffic difficulties by midnight. He dressed carefully for his task. A wool coat, properly buttoned. His heavy scarf, wound precisely twice around his neck. Leather gloves, expensive ones he'd had for 20 years and had kept in perfect condition. He tucked a small notebook and pen into his inner pocket, along with the list of participating houses Margaret Thorne had provided. 32 addresses. He'd plotted an efficient route that would minimize backtracking. As he prepared to leave, Arthur caught sight of his reflection in the hallway mirror. An old man looked back at him, thin and stern, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed perpetually skeptical. When had he become so severe? He couldn't quite remember. It felt as though he'd always been this way, though surely that couldn't be true. There must have been a time when he smiled more, when his default expression wasn't this perpetual frown. He turned away from the mirror and stepped out into the snowy evening. The first house was only 3 blocks from his own, a cheerful colonial with a front porch that someone had outlined in multicolored lights. Arthur paused on the sidewalk, withdrawing his notebook. The lights blinked in an irregular pattern that made his eye twitch. No rhythm, no discernible sequence. Just random flashing that seemed designed specifically to irritate anyone with even a passing appreciation for order. He wrote, House 1, inconsistent light pattern, appears random, color choice questionable. The next house was worse. An inflatable Santa Claus, easily 12 feet tall, swayed precariously in a wind gust as Arthur approached. The thing was tethered to the ground with what appeared to be garden stakes, a solution that struck Arthur as profoundly inadequate. One good storm and that monstrosity would be sailing down Main Street like a wayward zeppelin. House 2, inflatable decoration, structural integrity concerns, safety hazard. On he walked, his boots crunching through the fresh snow, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The town was quiet in that particular way of winter evenings. Sounds muffled and softened, the world wrapped in white. If Arthur had been of a more poetic disposition, he might have found it beautiful. As it was, he simply noted that the snow's acoustic properties were reducing ambient noise by approximately 50%. House 3 featured a nativity scene where the baby Jesus appeared to be the same size as one of the sheep. House 4 had icicle lights hung at such irregular intervals that Arthur's fingers itched to take them down and rehang them properly. House 5's reindeer seemed to be missing a leg, giving it an unfortunate listing quality that suggested either a manufacturing defect or significant damage. Arthur dutifully recorded each failing in his notebook. By House 10, a peculiar pattern had emerged. Arthur's criticisms, while valid from a technical standpoint, were beginning to feel hollow even to him. Yes, the lights were crooked. Yes, the colors clashed. Yes, the inflatable snowman was an affront to both physics and good taste. But through every window he passed, he could see the same thing. Families gathered in warm living rooms, children pointing excitedly at their handiwork, adults sipping what he presumed was hot chocolate or mulled wine. They were happy. That was the uncomfortable truth. They were pleased with their imperfect, chaotic, technically questionable displays. And their neighbors, walking past in small groups, were admiring them, commenting on them, taking photographs. No one seemed bothered by the crooked strings or clashing colors or inflatable monstrosities. No one but Arthur. He turned onto Maple Street, where the decorations reached new heights of elaborate excess. One house had synchronized their lights to music broadcast on a low-power FM frequency. Arthur could hear the tinny sounds of Jingle Bell Rock as he approached, could see the lights pulsing and shifting in time with the beat. It was technically impressive, he had to admit, even as he found it gaudy and overwhelming. House 15, choreographed light display, technically complex, aesthetically excessive. Beside it stood a home that had clearly decided more was better. Every available surface was covered in lights. The roof, the gutters, the windows, the bushes, the trees in the yard, even the mailbox. It blazed like a small sun against the darkness, bright enough that Arthur had to squint. Someone had erected a sign in the front yard, Griswold Family, Christmas Vacation Tribute. Arthur had never seen the movie. He'd heard about it, of course. Some silly comedy about holiday decorating gone wrong. The fact that someone had devoted this much time, effort, and undoubtedly money to recreating it struck him as fundamentally absurd. House 16, excessive illumination, probable violation of light pollution ordinances, pop culture reference of dubious value. A gust of wind sent snow swirling around Arthur's legs. He pulled his scarf tighter and continued walking. His nose was cold. His feet, despite his good boots, were beginning to feel the chill. How much longer would this take? He consulted his list, 22 addresses remaining. He'd barely crossed the halfway point. The houses continued in their chaotic variety. Some traditional, some modern, some so bizarre that Arthur couldn't quite parse what they were attempting to convey. One house had what appeared to be a lights and plywood construction of a dragon. A Christmas dragon. The mind boggled. But slowly, despite himself, Arthur began noticing other things. At House 19, the lights weren't store-bought strands, but rather small paper luminarias, dozens of them, lined up with perfect evenness along the walkway and porch. Someone had cut snowflakes into the paper bags, and when the candles inside burned, the patterns glowed outward. It was simple, understated, rather beautiful actually. At House 21, he spotted handmade ornaments hanging from the porch rafters, carved wooden stars, painted with care, each one different. The work was skilled but imperfect in that way that speaks of human hands rather than machine production. Someone had spent hours on these, Arthur realized. Someone had cared enough to make something rather than simply buy something. At House 24, a family was still outside decorating, a father on a ladder while two children held the end of a light strand, and a mother called up directions. They were laughing at something, their voices carrying in the cold air, and as Arthur walked past, the mother waved to him. "Merry Christmas!" she called out cheerfully. Arthur, caught off guard, raised one gloved hand in response. "Yes, Merry Christmas," he replied, his voice sounding rusty with disuse. The family went back to their decorating, and Arthur continued walking, but something had shifted. The cold seemed less biting, the snow seemed less an impediment and more a gentle addition to the evening. He found himself looking at the houses differently, trying to see past the technical flaws to whatever had motivated their creation. He paused at the corner of Elm and 3rd Street, standing beneath a street lamp that cast a circle of golden light in the falling snow. This was the oldest part of town, where the houses dated back 100 years or more, where the streets were narrower and the trees grew tall enough to form a canopy overhead. In the summer, this neighborhood was shaded and cool. In winter, it felt almost enchanted, the Victorian-era homes glowing with warm light behind their decorations. Arthur realized he was tired. Not just physically, though his feet ached and his fingers were numb despite his gloves, but tired in a deeper way. Tired of his own critical voice, tired of finding fault, tired of standing apart from a community that seemed to have found joy in something he'd dismissed as frivolous. When had he become so bitter? He thought of Margaret, his wife, who'd loved Christmas with a passion he'd never understood. She'd decorated their home every year, even in the later years when her arthritis made it difficult. He'd helped, of course, had hung the lights where she'd directed, but he'd never quite grasped her delight in it. It had seemed like so much effort for something temporary. "It's not about the decorations, Arthur," she'd told him once near the end. "It's about making something bright in the dark. It's about telling the world, and yourself, that you still believe in beauty and hope and joy." He'd thought he understood then. But perhaps he hadn't. Perhaps he'd never really understood at all. Arthur shook himself and continued walking. 8 more houses to go. 8 more chances to find fault, to note imperfections, to maintain the standards he'd held himself and others to for so many years. The next 3 houses were unremarkable. Nice enough displays, competently executed, nothing that particularly moved him one way or another. He made brief notes and moved on, his route taking him in a gradual circle back toward his own neighborhood. House 30 was notable for its simplicity. White lights only, strung along the roofline and wrapped around the porch columns. A single wreath on the door, fresh balsam from the smell of it. Nothing flashy, nothing excessive. In its restraint, it had an elegance that Arthur appreciated. He made a note that this might be a contender. House 31 was clearly the work of teenagers allowed free creative reign. It looked like a collision between a toy store and an electrical supply warehouse. Nothing matched, nothing coordinated. It was chaos incarnate. And yet, there was something exuberant about it, something that spoke of youthful enthusiasm, unconstrained by concerns about taste or propriety. Arthur almost smiled. Almost. And then he arrived at House 32. The last house on his list was on Birch Lane, a short dead-end street on the far edge of town. Arthur had been here before, years ago, though he couldn't remember why. The houses were smaller here, more modest. The kind of homes that working families bought as starter houses and often never left. The house at the end of the lane was clearly older than its neighbors. The paint was faded, the porch slightly sagging, the roof in need of replacement. In summer, Arthur imagined, it would be shabby in that sad way that speaks of limited resources and deferred maintenance. In winter, covered in snow, it had a certain dignity that poverty couldn't entirely erase. The Christmas display was simple. A single strand of white lights had been strung along the porch railing. In the small front yard stood a modest nativity scene, but not a purchased one. These figures had been carved from wood, painted by hand, and arranged with obvious care around a manger that was really just a wooden crate lined with hay. The figures were crude, the sort of thing someone might make who had more enthusiasm than skill, but they'd been placed with such evident thought that Arthur found himself stepping closer to look. The Mary was slightly lopsided. The Joseph's face was more suggestion than detail. The baby Jesus was disproportionately large, and one of the sheep appeared to be missing an ear. By any objective standard, this was amateur work. But something made Arthur crouch down beside the little scene, his knees protesting the movement, to look more closely. Each figure had been sanded smooth. The wood surface worked until it felt soft under his fingertips. The paint, while simple, had been applied in multiple thin coats, the kind of patience that suggests someone who'd taken their time, who'd cared about doing it right even without the skill to make it perfect. And there were details: a tiny painted star on Mary's cloak, a careful line of stitching painted onto Joseph's robe, the faintest hint of a smile on the baby's face. This had taken someone hours, days, probably. Someone had sat with pieces of wood and sandpaper and paint, had worked and reworked these little figures, had poured an enormous amount of effort into creating something they must have known would be judged imperfect by anyone with even basic woodworking skills. Why? Why go to all that trouble? Arthur stood, his knees aching, and looked at the house itself. A single light was on in the front room, and through the window, he could see an elderly person sitting in an armchair. From this distance, Arthur couldn't make out details, but the figure seemed small, possibly frail, wrapped in blankets despite being indoors. The answer came to him with uncomfortable clarity. Someone had made this display because they wanted to, because despite their limited resources and limited skills and undoubtedly limited energy, they'd wanted to create something beautiful for the holiday. They'd wanted to participate in the community's tradition. They'd wanted to bring a little light into the darkness. Just like Margaret had said. Arthur felt something crack inside his chest, a long frozen thing beginning to thaw. He looked at the crude little nativity scene, at the simple strand of lights, at the humble house with its lone occupant, and he felt, for the first time in years, a genuine warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. This was what Christmas was supposed to be about. Not perfection, not technical excellence, not lights strung with mathematical precision or colors chosen according to proper theory. It was about love, about effort, about making something, anything, that said, I care, and I tried, and I believe there should be light in the darkness. All the other houses he'd judged suddenly looked different in his memory. The crooked lights strung by a father balanced on a ladder while his children watched. The excessive display that made a whole family laugh at its own absurdity. The handmade ornaments that represented hours of careful work. The synchronized lights that someone had spent weeks programming. They'd all been acts of love. Imperfect, excessive, sometimes baffling acts of love, but love nonetheless. And he, Arthur Abernathy, master clockmaker, precision perfectionist, had walked past all of them seeing only flaws. He stood in the snow for a long time, staring at the humble little display, feeling tears prick at his eyes. When was the last time he'd cried? He couldn't remember. Not at Margaret's funeral, though he'd felt her loss like a physical wound. Not in all the years since. He'd held himself together, maintained his standards, refused to acknowledge anything that might crack his carefully constructed armor of criticism and dismissal. But here, on a cold December evening, standing before a scene carved by unskilled but devoted hands, Arthur felt that armor finally break. He reached up and touched his cheek. His glove came away damp. How long had he been so alone? How long had he held himself apart from the world, judging and finding fault, maintaining standards that had somehow turned from professional pride into personal isolation? Years. 8 years since Margaret died, but if he was honest, it had started before that. Slowly, imperceptibly, he'd let his perfectionism curdle into something meaner, something that pushed people away rather than drew them close. He thought of his workshop with its ticking clocks and its absence of any human sound. He thought of his days, each one structured and solitary and safe. He thought of the last time someone had invited him to dinner, to a party, to anything at all. It had been so long he couldn't remember, and suddenly that felt like the most terrible thing in the world. "Good evening." Arthur startled, turning to find a woman had approached without his noticing. She was perhaps 60, bundled in a worn coat, carrying a bag of groceries. She smiled at him, a kind expression that suggested she thought his interest in the display was genuine appreciation rather than critical judgment. "It's lovely, isn't it?" she said, nodding toward the nativity. "My father made it. He's 87 now, lives alone since Mom passed. His hands shake something terrible and his eyes aren't what they were, but he wanted to do it. Took him most of the autumn. He was so worried it wouldn't be good enough, that people would think it was shabby. I told him people would love it because he made it with love, but I don't think he believed me." She gestured toward the window where the elderly figure sat. "That's him there. He'll be watching to see if anyone stops to look. I'm his daughter, Ellen. I stop by every day to check on him, bring him groceries and such. Are you the judge?" Arthur nodded, not trusting his voice. Ellen's smile widened. "Well then, I hope you'll be kind in your judgment. It's not fancy, I know, but it meant the world to him to be able to participate." Arthur finally found his voice. "It's remarkable," he said quietly. "The craftsmanship, the care." Ellen looked surprised, then pleased. "Thank you. That means a lot. I'll tell him you said so. Merry Christmas." She walked up to the house, letting herself in, and Arthur could see her through the window, speaking to her father, gesturing back toward where Arthur stood. The old man's face lit up, visible even from the street. Arthur raised his hand in a small wave, and the old man waved back. The walk home seemed to take no time at all. Arthur barely noticed the cold, barely registered the continued snowfall. His mind was entirely occupied with what he'd seen, what he'd felt, what he'd finally understood. Back in his own house, warm and orderly and profoundly empty, Arthur made himself a cup of tea and sat down at his desk in the workshop. The clocks ticked around him, each one keeping perfect time, each one a masterpiece of precision and craft. They were beautiful, and he was proud of them, but they were also cold. Perfect, but cold. He pulled out his notebook, looked at all the criticisms he'd recorded, and set it aside. Then he withdrew a sheet of his good writing paper and began to compose his official judgment. "Dear members of the Town Council and fellow citizens, I have completed my review of this year's Christmas light displays, and I write to you now with both my official judgment and a confession. My official judgment is this. The winner of this year's competition is the display at 47 Birch Lane, created by Mr. Harold Chen. My confession is this. I nearly missed it. I have spent this evening walking through our town with the eyes of a critic. I have noted crooked lights and clashing colors, questioned structural integrity and aesthetic choices. I have applied the standards of precision and technical excellence that have guided my professional life to decorations created not by professionals, but by neighbors, by friends, by families. In doing so, I have failed to see what was most important. The display at 47 Birch Lane is not perfect. The figures are crude. The workmanship shows the limitations of aging hands and failing eyesight. By objective standards, it is simple, perhaps even shabby. But I have never seen anything created with more love. Every figure in that small nativity scene represents hours of careful work. Every painted detail speaks to patience and devotion. The entire display is a testament to what can be created when someone believes, despite all obstacles, that there should be beauty and light in the world. I have learned tonight that perfection is not the measure of worth. Love is. Effort is. The courage to create something knowing it will be imperfect, but making it anyway because the world needs more light, more beauty, more expressions of hope. Every house I visited tonight embodied this truth. Every string of lights, no matter how crooked, was an act of hope. Every inflatable snowman, no matter how garish, was an act of joy. Every synchronized display, no matter how excessive, was an act of celebration. But because we are willing to try, I award the prize to Mr. Chen because his display moved me in a way I have not been moved in many years. It reminded me that our job as human beings is not to achieve perfection, but to create beauty and connection wherever we can, with whatever gifts we have, for as long as we are able. Thank you for entrusting me with this responsibility. It has taught me more than you could know. Respectfully, Arthur Abernathy. Arthur read over what he'd written, then carefully folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. He would deliver it to the town council office first thing in the morning. He sat for a long time afterward, listening to his clock's tick, but for once the sound didn't comfort him. The precision, the perfect mechanical order, felt hollow in a way it never had before. Through his workshop window, he could hear distant sounds, laughter from somewhere down the street, a car door closing, someone calling out good night to someone else. The ordinary sounds of a community he'd been living beside rather than within for longer than he cared to admit. It wasn't too late to change that, was it? Arthur stood and walked to his window, looking out at his own dark, undecorated house. He'd never seen the point of decorating just for himself, but perhaps that had been wrong thinking. Perhaps the point was never just for oneself. Perhaps the point was to say to the world, I am here. I believe in beauty. I want to participate in the collective creation of light. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would visit the hardware store and purchase some lights. Nothing fancy, nothing excessive. Just enough to say that he too was part of this community, that he too believed in making something bright in the darkness. The next day dawned clear and cold, the fresh snow sparkling under a brilliant blue sky. Arthur delivered his letter to the town council office, where Margaret Thorne read it with tears in her eyes and clasped his hand warmly. The council would announce the winner at the Christmas Eve gathering in the town square. She told him. Would he come? Arthur, who had not attended a community gathering in 8 years, said yes. Word spread quickly through the small town. By afternoon, people were talking about Arthur's letter, about his choice, about his unexpected philosophical reflections on the true meaning of the competition. Several people stopped by his house to tell him they'd enjoyed his judgment, that it had made them think differently about their own decorations. Eleanor Morrison, who lived 3 doors down, brought him a plate of cookies. I'm so glad you've decided to be more sociable, she said with a warm smile. We've missed you, Arthur. It's nice to have you back. Back, as though he'd been somewhere and returned. In a way, he supposed he had. That evening, Arthur stood on his front porch, hanging a simple string of white lights along the railing. His fingers, stiff with age and cold, fumbled with the clips. The strand hung slightly crooked when he'd finished. He looked at it critically, started to adjust it, then stopped. It was good enough. It was better than nothing. It was a beginning. On Christmas Eve, Arthur walked to the town square where the community had gathered for the annual tree lighting and announcement of the light competition winner. He hadn't attended in so long that many of the younger families didn't know who he was. But the older residents remembered, and they welcomed him back with the particular warmth reserved for lost things found again. When his letter was read aloud, and the winner announced, Arthur watched Harold Chen's daughter Ellen help her elderly father onto the small platform. Harold looked overwhelmed and deeply moved, tears streaming down his weathered face. When he spoke, his voice was shaky but clear. I never thought, he said, that my little carvings would win anything. I just wanted to do my part, to be part of this community, to make something that said I was still here, still alive, still believing in something beautiful. Thank you. Thank you all. The crowd applauded, and Arthur found himself clapping along with them, his eyes stinging with tears he no longer tried to hide. Afterward, Ellen found him in the crowd. Thank you, she said simply. You've given my father more joy than you could possibly know. He's been alone too long. We've been worried about him. I understand, Arthur said quietly. I've been alone too long myself. Ellen smiled. Well then, we're having Christmas dinner tomorrow at my house. Dad will be there and my family. We'd love to have you join us if you'd like. It won't be fancy, but there'll be plenty of food and good company. Arthur felt something in his chest, something warm and unfamiliar and terribly fragile. Hope, perhaps. Connection, the possibility of not being quite so alone. I would like that very much, he said. Thank you. On Christmas morning, Arthur woke early as he always did, but instead of his usual tea and solitary silence, he found himself humming quietly as he moved around his kitchen. He'd accepted another invitation the night before to join the carolers who would be singing through the neighborhoods that evening. His voice was rusty, he'd warned them, but they'd assured him they would take anyone willing to try. In his workshop, the clocks ticked their perfect mechanical rhythms. But Arthur left the door open, and through it drifted the sound of children playing in the snow, someone shoveling their driveway, a dog barking with joy, the sounds of a community. His community. One he was, finally, beginning to rejoin. He looked at the crude little wooden figure he'd begun carving the previous evening, his first attempt at the craft. It was terrible, objectively speaking. The proportions were wrong. The details were clumsy. His hands didn't have the strength or steadiness they once did, but he would finish it anyway. He would paint it with care, and next Christmas, he would add it to his simple display of lights. Proof that even an old perfectionist could learn to value love over precision, connection over criticism, light over darkness. Through his window, the winter sun illuminated his modest home, and for the first time in years, Arthur looked at his life not with the critical eye of a judge, but with gratitude. There was still time. There was still light. There was still, he realized with quiet joy, so much still to love. If this story resonated with you, if Mr. Abernathy's journey from criticism to compassion touched something in your heart, please consider showing your support with a like, and subscribe to Deep Sleep Stories Hub for more quiet nights and restful journeys. Sleep well, and may you always remember that love, not perfection, is the true measure of what we create in this world.